Welcome back to Business Ethics. My name's Tom, and this video is talking about chapter 5 in our textbook, which is about organizational culture, right? At the beginning of my notes, I mentioned that this is, we're moving to a normative approach to business ethics. Now, the difference between a descriptive approach to anything and a normative approach is basically a descriptive approach just describes what a thing is, and a normative approach discusses and considers, how a thing ought to be. Right? Normative has to do with rules, has to do with, what a thing should be doing. Right? And so for business ethics, right, a descriptive approach would be a description of the way businesses have behaved or often do, and then a normative approach would have to do with what you should do with your business or what people should do with their businesses, right? Now, that doesn't quite line up because we've been doing a lot of ethical theory, which is all about how a person should act. But a lot of what we've been talking about is, what capitalism is, what a business is, right? And we've also been talking about, what ethics are, right? Or what, different ethical theories amount to. And now, and we've also talked about stakeholder orientation, what a stakeholder orientation is and what it is for a company to kind of assume a CSR kind of orientation, socially responsible kind of model. And now we're moving towards this idea of organizational culture and talking about a particular dynamic in actually implementing, right, some of kind of the insights of a stakeholder orientation, right? And one kind of big hurdle there or a big dynamic is this idea of kind of organizational culture, which we'll talk about more in the next video. But in this video, it's just kind of a primer on this idea. Okay, so now one kind of big distinction that they make in the book, right, is between what they call individual factors and organizational factors. And those are factors in terms of interests, right? So individual factors are interests that are specific to an individual, right? And organizational factors have to do with interests with respect to the organization as a whole, right? And the way they break down kind of personal factors, they really kind of focus more on kind of personal identity factors, race, gender, age, so on and so forth. But you can just think about anything that really pertains to you as a particular individual, right? So, and think about this in the context of being part of a business or getting a job, right? So I have particular interest in my job. I want to get paid well. I want a good work-life balance, and I want, good health benefits or something like this, right? Now, the organizational, those are kind of like my main interests, let's say. For the organization, they might have more interests on, say, the bottom line, right? They're more concerned with turning a good profit and expanding, right? That's the organization as a whole. And those interests can align, and sometimes they can also not align, right? So maybe the healthcare thing is one that the organization as a whole thinks it affects their bottom line too much, and they would rather skimp on that. Or maybe they're not really, as an organization, they don't like a healthy work-life balance. They prefer to have people work late hours, and because they want the productivity, and they kind of capitalize on that dynamic, right? And so they could come apart. But you could also imagine that when I'm interviewing at a company or something like this, that they also agree with those things because they find that to align with their mission, right? Especially if you have, say, a company that is like a wellness company and they want to kind of put their money where their mouth is in terms of taking care of their employees, right? And that fits with their business model and their mission as an agency, right? Overall. So these are kind of two sides of the same coin, so to speak, right? If you're going to be part of a company. And also, there are, with individual factors, there are particularities, peculiarities, idiosyncrasies to individuals that can sometimes conflict with the organizational kind of um, goals and aims, right? And so, one example that I draw attention to in my notes is this example from United Airlines. And there was a case a while back where a passenger, was forcibly removed from a flight. He didn't do anything wrong. They were bumping people from the flight because they needed to have crew members on that flight. They always kind of um, tried to arrange for spots for them, and this flight was totally booked, like booked. And so they were randomly selecting passengers, and this individual got selected, and he said he didn't want to leave. And he is a doctor, he had patients, he needed to get back. And they decided that they were just going to call the police in the airport, and just have him removed. And it didn't go well. Everyone had their cameras on their phones, and it was a very bad look for United Airlines. Now, one thing about this situation is there are, what would you say, the spirit and the letter of, you know, the policy in terms of it advancing United Airlines interests, right? They need to get crew members from point A to point B. This is part of their business model. Most airlines do something like this. They have pilots and crew members fly, right, with them, so they can start their shift in Texas or whatever, even if they live in Milwaukee. But um, but then there's also the particularities about the individuals, right? And the individuals in the situation, and to what extent they carry out that policy, and how they react to carrying out that policy, right? You can imagine that many individuals kind of in the chain of command, so to speak, might be more hot-headed. They might be more strict about the rules. Some might not want to have to do this, right? And they might be more reluctant. And all these kind of factors can kind of spill over into a situation like this, right? And so I kind of called attention to this, and I asked students to look at it and think about, you know, what factors in this might have stemmed from just individual factors, people who, either are not interested in carrying out this policy, or disagree with it, or are very hot-headed or too passive, this kind of stuff, how that might have factored into it versus the kind of overall United Airlines policy in terms of removing customers, right? So that's just kind of gives you a little bit of sense of this dynamic and how they can both play into a situation like this. And now, when you take the other kind of big picture thing I like to call attention to on this, is kind of like the overall orientation of social dynamics, right? And this is not exactly in the textbook, but it's something I think that's important, kind of preps us for the idea of organizational culture, corporate culture, and this kind of stuff. Um, I mentioned that all kind of social organizations have a reciprocal structure, right? And what do I mean by this? Well, means that the people on the top kind of need the people on the bottom, right? And the people on the bottom kind of need the people on the top, so to speak, right? So, your employer needs to have employees in order to be an employee, and in order to be an employee, you need an employer to pay you, right? There's kind of a reciprocal structure going on there. And this is true in any kind of organization. But there are different kind of dynamics, different kinds of structure you might see, right? So I mentioned one where the reciprocity is more pronounced, right? It's more central to the structure, is something like a democracy, right? The idea is that the general public votes on things, and those and their vote is supposed to vote elect officials or vote on policies that are supposed to reflect their interests, right? And this way we think about democracy is supposed to be like the voice of the people through government, but you still have a government. You want a government in place because it gives your voice more power, right? Because you can vote on things, and your opinion can, you know, start to contribute to what is law, right? There is this kind of reciprocity, right? Where the government needs the voice of the people, and the voice of the people needs the government in order to kind of amplify it, right, and give it teeth. Um, but I also mentioned another kind of social structure, which is the military, right? The military is not as reciprocal, right? It's very top down. Like you have your chain of command, and the people on the top tell the kind of ground level soldiers what to do, right? And there's reasons for this, right? You don't want, your soldiers to question their orders, right? You want them to carry them out because presumably the people who gave the orders had really good reasons for doing it, right? Had really thought about that. But there still is some degree of reciprocity, right? So, for example, a general is not really a general if there aren't people underneath that general to do what the general says, right? And also, the soldiers, right, need someone above them in the chain of command in order to kind of give them their role, right? So you do have this kind of reciprocity, but it is a lot less reciprocal, right? And why do I say this? Well, I'm trying to highlight a kind of dynamic where what you might call a healthy organizational culture. Business is somewhere in the middle, right? And it really needs to kind of stay in the sweet spot in the middle. And the idea in a business, I think, in a healthy organizational culture, or at least one idea for that, is that it's a case where the individual interests or individual factors really line up with the organizational factors, right? And there are different ways to express this. Oftentimes, someone sticks with a job because they feel like their sense of purpose is, able to be advanced by working for this company, right? I believe in, people having healthy food or something like this. And so I work for a health food store, right? Our interests align, my individual interests and interests of the organization as a whole, right? Or I believe in, the advancement of AI. And so I work for a software company, right? That makes AI, right? My individual kind of purpose lines up with the purpose of the company as a whole, right? And this kind of goes back to um, uh, the idea of Aristotle, right? And he talks about this kind of harmony between different kind of facets of our kind of dispositions, our emotional dispositions, um, our you know intellect and our virtues and all these kinds of things and who we hang out with and our moral education, kind of lining up all these things in order to act in the correct way based on a kind of good and a developed moral character. And I liken this to the idea of health, right? Which health is all about achieving that balance, right? And it has to do with, it's very holistic, right? It's about aligning kind of all of your kind of processes, right? Exercise, sleep, diet, all that kind of stuff. And this is a similar kind of idea of kind of like seeking this kind of harmony between the individual and the organization as a whole. And when that harmony gets out of whack, oftentimes organizations kind of suffer for that, right? So I think many of us have seen organizations where upper levels and management doesn't is really kind of out of touch with kind of ground level employees, right? And when you have that kind of disconnect and it becomes much more of a top down kind of culture, um, you can lose productivity, you lose efficiency, right? People at the top are not really um, in tune with what is going on with the actual day-to-day operations. So that's just kind of setting up this idea of corporate culture, which we will talk more about in the next video. Thanks for watching, and we will talk soon.